Good evening. In the first episode of the series on the history of Italy, I said that the history of Italy began in China when the Huns, expelled from the Chinese Empire, began their long trek towards Europe. And when they arrived, they upset the equilibrium existing, or almost existing, between the forces of the Roman Empire, ranged along what is called the limes, the frontier, and the so-called barbarians who were stationed outside the frontier. We also saw how the so-called barbarians gradually became the actual military branch of the Roman Empire, triggering a slow but inevitable integration. Because, then as now, control of the military leads almost always to the control of the politics of a state. Look at the United States today, 2019, where Trump was elected on the basis of his stated commitment to reduce the military presence and escalation around the world. But now, almost 3/4 of the way into the electoral cycle, not only there are still over 800 military bases across the world, but there are expansion programs on nuclear weapons, missiles, and who knows what and who knows where other secret expansion projects and regime changes are on the way. But I digress. The barbaric invasion of the Roman Empire turned out to be a slow but important cultural shift, especially in the West, that part of the empire nominally associated with Rome until it officially collapsed in the 5th century. This cultural shift, matured through the 4 successive centuries, caused the old Roman Empire to remake itself in the guise of a new Western Roman Empire, where the Romans were now the Franks, who were actually Germans, embodied into the historic and iconic figures of Charlemagne. The barbarian tribes were many, with greater or lesser influence on the flow of events, and it would be tedious and informationally unprofitable to review them all. Here I will attempt to follow the thread that in about 100 years led to what we know as the fall of Rome during the 5th century. And I will sketch the profile of at least some of the characters who, thanks to the historians of the time, have left their marks on the grand tapestry of history. In the first episode, we saw that the Roman Empire had allowed the Goths to settle in the region of the Balkans called Dacia or Dacia. But when the Huns arrived from the east, and one branch of the Goths called the Visigoths amassed themselves on the left of the banks of the Danube, approximately near the border of today's Bulgaria, near a town now today called Silistra, when they did this. The historian Eunapius, and here is a page from his Universal History, said that the Goths were crying and waving their arms, asking the Romans on the other side to help the Goths to cross the river. But the imperial authorities said they could not allow them to cross without the authorization of the Eastern Emperor, who at the time was called Valens I. From now on, opinions vary, and the most accepted version is that the emperor called Valens, for various strategic reasons, took in only a part of the fleeing Goths and imposed on them harsh conditions. And even this partial transfer took place with considerable confusion. The old and impaired were left on the other side of the Danube, and the children were sent into other parts of the empire. Furthermore, the Romans took all the Goths' possession, took the young men as slaves and the young girls as concubines, and all this incited the Goths to rebellion. They had undertaken a trek towards the city of Adrianople near Edirne in modern Turkey, and Emperor Valens thought he could make short shrift of the rebellious Goths, but in the ensuing battle in 324 AD, the Goths inflicted a sound defeat on the Roman army. Valens himself died along with 37 Roman generals. Christian historians said that Valens I was defeated for having sinned in allowing the Goths to cross the Danube before demanding their conversion from Arianism to Christianity. And we saw in the previous episode how Arianism essentially denied the divinity of Christ and the Christian concept of the Trinity. At this point, the empire had lost its emperor and everything seemed on the brink of collapse. In the west, there remained a general called Gratian, a good soldier but under the influence of a very authoritarian mother called Justina. By the way, even in this era referred to as the Dark Ages, some women in power exercised a significant influence on the course of events. Anyway, General Gratian apparently did not want to become the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, and as the only remaining man in charge, so to speak, he offered the throne of Constantinople to Theodosius, a Spaniard and the scion of a family who had distinguished itself in defending Britain from the Scots. You may remember, or the Pits, you may remember the Hadrian Wall, which we mentioned in the last episode, as well as he quelled a revolt of the Moors in Africa. Emperor Theodosius in the east and General Gratian in the west adopted towards the Goths what we call the contradictory policy. Not having an army anymore, they limited themselves to incursions against the Goths, that today these incursions would be called acts of terrorism. On the other hand, Theodosius declared himself ready to reconciliation, meaning between the Goths and the Eastern Empire. Then, on 380 AD, the Huns appeared again, and the Goths were forced to cross the Danube once more and ask Theodosius for hospitality. Unlike the previous emperor, Valens, the one who was killed at Adrianople, Theodosius welcomed the Goths called Atanarico, with open arms and escorted him to Constantinople. When Atanarico died, the emperor organized an impressive funeral, and in turn this impressed the Goths so much that they decided to let themselves be absorbed into the empire under the classification of federati, which means confederates. Things looked pretty good in the east then, but in the west they were terrible. Another general called Maximus had killed the General Gratian, the one who offered to Theodosius the Eastern Empire. The heir to Gratian, who when alive was the de facto ruler of the West, was his half-brother Valentinian II, son of Justina, whom we met before. Then Maximus, the usurper, crossed the Alps with his army, at which Justina, with son Valentinian II and her 3 daughters, escaped to Constantinople. Theodosius met her in Thessaloniki in Greece, and here in Thessaloniki Theodosius was impressed by the graces of one of Justina's daughters called Galla. Theodosius was a widower, well over 40 years old, with a son called Honorius, a curious character whom we will also meet later on. Galla instead was only 16, but the marriage took place, and as a wedding gift to his wife, or rather to his now mother-in-law Justina, Theodosius gave back the throne of the Western Empire to Valentinian II. After the wedding, Theodosius moved with his army towards the west, crossed the Alps to meet the forces of this usurper Maximus. It is interesting to observe that now the 2 contrasting armies were essentially all composed by barbarian soldiers, German on the side of Theodosius and Franks, that is also Germans, on the side of Maximus. There was not one Latin or Roman name among the generals of both armies. Theodosius defeated and captured Maximus and asked him, "Is it true that you killed Gratian with my approval?" "It is not true," replied Maximus. "I only did it to ensure the obedience of the soldiers," at which the soldiers of Theodosius decapitated Maximus on the spot. And then for the next 4 years, we're talking about the end of the 5th century, there was relative peace. it would actually seem that the empire was again unified, because the nominal emperor of the West, the 20-year-old Valentinian, was essentially a figurehead. Then Valentinian II, actually, was also killed by a Frankish general called Arbogast, who did not tolerate being given orders by a boy, meaning Valentinian II. Arbogast gave him a letter of resignation, meaning a letter to Valentinian to sign, and then instead of waiting for Valentinian to sign it, he just killed him. We could say that Arbogast was another Guaidó of Venezuela before his times. Guaidó, of course, is the current Venezuelan usurper. Again. As with the previous usurper, Maximus, Theodosius did not react, notwithstanding the insistence of his wife Galla, who was the sister of Valentinian II, and who wanted an immediate punishment. Then Galla died while giving birth to a daughter called Galla Placidia, who later made a name for herself in the intricate history of his time. Now Theodosius moved with an army to Italy and defeated the Frankish general Arbogast in 395 AD on the banks of the river Isonzo, at the time called Frigidus, meaning cold. What is interesting about this battle along the river Isonzo, or Frigidus if you like, it's a river that over 1500 years later would see the horrors of World War I. And to say what is interesting is that it was the last battle fought between a pagan army, that of Arbogast, and a Christian army led by Theodosius. After the battle, Theodosius returned to Milan, but he was too old and ill to travel to Constantinople. He bequeathed the Western throne to his second son Honorius, and the Eastern throne to his eldest son Arcadius. Theodosius passed into history as Theodosius the Great, but on his greatness historians disagree. But the attribution is a mnemonic help for those who should perhaps pass an examination on the history of this period. Honorius was an interesting character, described by historians as a somewhat mean, without talent and great interest, other than having a great fondness for the chickens that he raised. He had moved his residence from Rome to Ravenna for security reasons, as we would say today, but he had named his favorite hen Rome, and he cared for his hen with great diligence and assiduity. The story goes that when Rome surrendered to the Gothic warrior Alaric, whom we will see later, a servant came to tell Honorius that Rome had fallen. Distraught, Honorius exclaimed, "But she was in perfect health just yesterday." "Not your chicken, not your hen called Rome," said the servant, "but Rome the capital." "Thank God," said Honorius, and breathed a sigh of relief. But let's go in order. Before dying, Theodosius had assigned to a trusted general by the name of Stilicho the task of watching and helping his chicken-loving son Honorius, now Emperor of the West. But in the same year, 395 AD, when Honorius became emperor in the West, a section of the Goths called Visigoths chose as their leader a general called Alaric, who had already fought in the army of Theodosius in the battle against the then decapitated usurper Maximus that we saw before. Of course, no need to remember all this, but it goes to show how intricate were the relationships and the exchanges that surrounded the history of what remained of the original Roman imperial structure, and the eventual total transfer of power to the barbarians, in this instance the Goths. This Gothic king Alaric typifies the cultural conflict, if you like, surrounding this transfer of power. When Theodosius died, Alaric felt discharged from his oath of loyalty to Theodosius and began a march to the conquest of Greece. But when he reached Athens, he was so impressed by the antique splendor and the monuments of the city that he decided on the spot to sign a pact of friendship with the Athenians. In the meantime, Stilicho, the guardian of Honorius, I mean the chicken-loving emperor of the West, as I said, arrived to dislodge Alaric and his Visigoths from Greece. But for whatever reason, Stilicho did not succeed, and the Eastern Emperor, the other son of Theodosius by the name of Arcadius, with the intention of assuaging Alaric, conferred to him the position of governor of Illyria, as you see in the map. Stilicho had given his daughter in marriage to the chicken-loving Honorius, and at the beginning of the 5th century he was elected as a Roman consul. The newly elected Roman consul, by tradition going back to the times of the Roman Republic, gave their name to the new year. Though by now the position of consul was purely formal, it was the first time that a barbarian was given this honor. Anyway, Stilicho discharged his duty as protector and guardian of Honorius well. He repulsed the Picts in England, and the government of Honorius and Stilicho enacted a series of laws aimed at reintegrating the Roman aristocracy into the affairs of the empire. Nevertheless, the effective capital of the Western Roman Empire in 402 AD was transferred to Ravenna on the Adriatic Sea. All seemed peaceful for a while until Alaric, the Visigoth general, showed up with his army on this side of the Julian Alps. Why Alaric left his settled position as governor of Illyria to invade Italy, we don't know. Subsequent events show that, perhaps, more than transforming Italy into a Gothic kingdom, he aimed at becoming a bigwig, as we would say today, a bigwig of the Western Roman Empire. Perhaps taking the place of Stilicho at the court of Ravenna. In the circumstances, Stilicho met the troops of Alaric near the Piedmontese fortified town of Pollenza. He won, but the information here is uncertain. Apparently the wife and daughter of Alaric fell in the hands of Stilicho, who however returned them to Alaric. Anyway, in gratitude for Stilicho's victory, the Romans elected him as the savior of the city, but that was not the end of Alaric. After some unsuccessful forays in the surroundings of Constantinople, where he was attempting unsuccessfully to enter into the service of the Eastern Emperor, Alaric returned to Italy and sent an embassy to Rome asking for compensation of the costs that he incurred during his stint in Greece when the Eastern Roman Emperor refused his services. Curiously, Stilicho suggested to the Romans to accept to compensate Alaric for the job he did not get at the Eastern court. Honorius, the chicken-loving man, the emperor, signed the letter accepting Alaric's request, but then Honorius traveled to Pavia with an advisor who turned out to be a traitor by the name of Olympius. And while Honorius was in Pavia, the garrison there rebelled and killed all soldiers who had been friends of Stilicho, barbarians. Historians suggest that the rebels were the remaining Roman troops in the army of the empire. But on hearing this, the chiefs of the barbarian army gathered in Bologna and wanted to have the mutineers killed. Stilicho did not approve, and he did not want enmity between the barbarians and Rome, because he had in mind perhaps a dream of integration and a reunification of the Eastern and Western empires as in the glorious past days of Rome. When Honorius returned to Ravenna, curiously, he ordered Stilicho arrested. Stilicho took refuge in a church, but when he got out, he found out that the emperor had ordered his execution, and he was decapitated outside the church on the 23rd of August of 408 AD. In turn, this caused the defection of 30,000 barbarian soldiers into the army of Alaric, who, as we found before, had just crossed the Alps and marched on Rome. And this was the second time after several centuries that an enemy army laid siege on Rome. The Romans panicked. Many attributed the event to Rome having abandoned the ancient gods of paganism, who now punished their heresy. Even the Pope Innocent I, recognizing the emergency, allowed the pagans' rites to be performed again. As you can imagine, the project was not successful. Negotiations with Alaric started again, and his demands were 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 3,000 pounds of pepper, 4,000 silk tunics. And these statistics about the request of Alaric are interesting as an indication of the evolution of taste and culture, we could say, in the habits of the barbarians. As for the Romans, who lately had returned to paganism, they put together the loot for Alaric by despoiling the statues of the gods whom they had of late returned to worship. Why did Alaric seem so relatively reasonable in his demands? Because his aim was to become a partner and defender of the Roman Empire, a kind of NATO before its times. He sent a message to Honorius saying that if we let him govern England, France, and Spain, which at the time were in rebellion, he, Alaric, would have governed these countries in his name, in the name of Honorius. But Honorius refused and gave him a very insulting answer. Not only Alaric, but no one belonging to his race will ever acquire this type of charge. Alaric's reaction was that of a man wounded in his honor and possibly in his inferiority complex as a barbarian. Now the Romans began to perceive Honorius as an enemy instead of a friend and supported a new emperor of their own, a certain guy called Attalus. It was almost a repeat of the current affairs in Venezuela, with a new president essentially appointed by the United States. Alaric was not sure of this almost self-appointed president, so he told this new guy Attalus to reach him, Alaric, at Rimini, in the town of Rimini, where in front of a crowd ripped the imperial mantle and the diadem from Attalo and sent them to Honorius, once more hoping to enlist the friendship of Honorius. But for whatever reason, Honorius continued to refuse. It was then that Alaric lost his patience and after a brief siege attacked and invaded Rome. Of this sack of Rome we have only the accounts of ecclesiastical memorials. However, Alaric ordered that the Christian churches and structures should be saved. This sacking lasted about a week, after which Alaric took off with the booty, this time traveling toward the south of Italy, aiming at the tip of the Booth, Reggio. But along the way he was struck by malaria and died in Cosenza. His soldiers decided to dig a tomb that no one would discover and set 300 slaves to work to deviate the course of the river called Busento, after which they dug a grave in the middle of the dry river and let the waters of the river flow again on the original river bed, not without killing anyone who had worked on the project to keep it sacred. This legendary burial inspired the German poet to write a poem that was translated into Italian by a famous Italian poet called Carducci, a poem that, when I was in the equivalent of junior high, students were expected to learn by heart. Translated, it starts with these lines: Lugubrious chants resound at night from Cosenza on the river Busento. Lugubriously the river responds with its sleepy eddies. Alaric, as I said, is important because he represents and encompasses within himself the confused aspiration and the internal conflicts of the barbarian world in its effort to confront the Latin civilization. And I will end this second episode on the history of Italy talking about the city of Ravenna and how it came to play an important role in the early history of Italy. To recall, after the split between the Eastern and Western Roman empires with Emperor Diocletian in the year 284 AD, he further divided the actual administration of the two empires into four, what we call today, prefectures. In Italy, the prefecture, if you like, the administrative capital, was Milan. And after about 2,000 years, almost recalling Diocletian's decision, Milan is still called the moral capital of Italy, moral not so much in the sense of morality, but as a hub of industry and commerce. What about Rome, you will ask? Rome remained mostly the symbol, a powerful symbol, but the symbol of a past that was no more. It still had the Senate and other functions, and of course it was the capital of Christianity. So we could say that Rome, while maintaining the aura of an empire that was no more, was gradually becoming the capital of Christianity until the schism with the Oriental Church that was to happen about 600 years later. With the events I recounted in this episode, the issue with the Goths, Alaric, Honorius, Theodosius, and others, I have barely scratched the surface, and only perhaps a masochist or a specialist would attempt to remember all the names and characters that animated the scene before, around, and after the period of the fall of Rome at the hands of the Gothic king Alaric. Ravenna became important as a de facto prefecture or capital of the western arm of the Eastern Empire. Therefore it has the air and the style of a Byzantine city, with the beautiful church of St. Apollinare and its fantastic mosaics. At the time, other than being the major port on the Adriatic Sea, it was surrounded by water, which protected the city better than walls or other fortifications. But the historian Sidonius Apollinaris describes it as, and I read, a bog where everything is upside down. The walls crash, the waters are stagnant, the towers bubble up and boats get stuck in the mud. The baths freeze up and the houses burn. Humans alive die of thirst and the dead float around. Thieves are alert and the guards sleep. The priests practice usury and usurers chant religious prayers. Merchants and soldiers are merchants. Eunuchs learn the art of war and barbarian soldiers learn literature. It is a city on land that possesses nothing but water and whose original population consists only of mosquitoes, frogs, and toads. Yet, notwithstanding this unflattering description, Ravenna is one of the most romantic cities in Italy, and, as we will possibly see in another episode later, she became the capital of a Byzantine section of Italy under the direct control of Constantinople. Thank you for watching. Until then, I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Good night.